Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Diana Rayment. And Diana Rayment holds a PhD in canine behaviour assessment. She's worked in a variety of academic and industry settings, including as a researcher and educator, leading a shelter behaviour team and managing a shelter. Diana is now working to integrate and improve companion animal welfare and animal management practices in Australia throughout a variety of roles, including as a director of the Australian Institute of Animal Management, as program specialist with Pet Rescue, and in her own training and consulting business for council animal management teams and not-for-profit animal shelters. Please welcome Dr. Diana Rayment, the AIAM Companion Animal Management Plan template, a new resource for members.
Awesome, thank you. Thanks, Simone, for the intro. Now, before I start today, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the land and the traditional families of the Yugambeh region on which we gather today, and their elders past, present and emerging. Now, my aim for today's talk, because I know it's going to be a little bit dry because we're talking about animal management plans. I will do my best, I promise. But my aim is to really help you see what we see as the AIM board when we're thinking about animal management plans and the power and the key role that they can play in creating change and actually driving those positive initiatives and outcomes that can actually happen at a local level. Now, as the peak body working in animal management, local government is our key focus. That said though, we all know, because we're sitting in a room that's mixed full of a lot of people, that the whole ecosystem around animal management is much bigger than just LG. And we can't understand any one kind of portion of that ecosystem in isolation from the rest, because there's always push and pull and we always influence each other. And the thing about the push and pull, and part of, I suppose, the power that's potentially there in an animal management plan, is that oftentimes what tends to happen, and I'm sure most of us can relate to this, is at a local level, we've got a whole bunch of different people working in the space, but they're not working together. And so what that push and pull looks like is an enormous amount of work and commitment that happens, but it's inefficient. There's nobody actually driving what's going on. And so what that means is that progress, if it's happening at all, and sometimes it can feel like it's not, but my experience tells me that it often is, it just doesn't feel that way, that gets slowed because of the inefficiency. And so we really need to work on how to actually leverage off each other and make things happen quickly. And that's hopefully what your animal management plan can make happen. So, we've been the bus. So the bus is here because I wanted to help you understand what I think of when I'm thinking about the ecosystem at a local level. So to me, whenever I'm thinking going into a particular community, I look at everything that's going on, and for all of us who are working in this space, I see a bus full of superheroes. I am not a comic fan, so if I stuff something up, please forgive me. But generally, the theme's kind of always there. The bus is sometimes big, sometimes it's little, sometimes it's fancy, sometimes it's kind of old and needs some work. But on the bus, we tend to have those same kind of key people there. We've got the Batman types who really, really love, the gadgets and the tech and all that kind of stuff, and let's make things happen. We've got the Superman types where you kind of walk into the situation and you're like, I have no idea where you found the strength to do what you just did today, but I'm sure you're going to come back and do it tomorrow, because that's what you do. And then there's the Wonder Woman types who've got their, little tribe of warriors who are there, and they're coming in the back end and they're supporting all the pets in that space. And my kind of concern and my thought whenever I'm thinking about this bus is that often what I can see is a bus with all of these people on it and some really heated discussions about where the bus is going. And in those heated discussions, nobody acknowledges the fact that there's no driver. And oftentimes, the bus is heading down a hill, right? And so what we can sometimes happen is that we have a pretty rough ride along that way as we're heading down the hill with no driver. And then, if things go a little bit wrong, there's a whole conversation at that point about, who was responsible, where was the driver, and the answer is often that there's just not one. So, having a think about how we get a driver really requires that we have a think about the challenges that are actually experienced in the animal management space. It's important to acknowledge that this space is extremely complex. So within any animal management team, often the teams are quite small. We've got state government regulations, you heard a little bit about that, thanks Christina. You've got the local government kind of regulations and restrictions on what can happen. There's often internal priorities and directives that are actually restraining what can happen with that animal management team. And then there's things like, tight budgets, everybody's got them. Oftentimes, there's a lack of ability to actually get volunteers in. There's a whole bunch of things that are going on. And what that means is that oftentimes at the kind of ground level, what's happening is that everything is focused on the day-to-day tasks. And what that means is that, when you're there and you're pedalling really, really hard, you don't get that chance to actually sit back and think, where are we going? Because you're stuck on the bus, right? And you're pedaling. And so that part of it is really important to understand, and it's also important, and it's complex, to take the time to actually sit back and understand all of the different things that are impacting animal management in that one geographical space. So, the question that we hear a lot is, how do we actually make it happen? And it is whatever great idea has happened and has come across. So we come together, we share and learn. I'm really, I suppose, happy and a bit blessed, I suppose, in that oftentimes the people that I'm interacting with are already in the headspace of wanting to know how to do things better. They recognise the push and pull, they recognise the lack of direction, come, learn, hear about great things that are happening and think, that is very well and good for them, but that's not my reality. I don't have the budget. I don't have the support. My counsellors and my senior management are not supportive. I'm worried about what the public will do, or other people are worried about what the public will do or react to the thing that we're trying to implement. And what that means and what happens sometimes is that we come along to something like this, by Thursday night, you're like, this is awesome, I'm going to go home, I've got notes, I've got all these fantastic things. You go home and you're like, nah, there's way too many barriers, and so I'm just going to keep doing things the way I've always done them, because essentially it's a path of least resistance, and most of us are too really, really busy pedaling, right? And sometimes what can happen, and I feel like sometimes this can be worse, is that you go home with a really great idea, but you don't always have the data that you need, and that intricate data of what is your problem and who is your community and where are the cats coming from, how are the dog bites happening, all of those things. You don't actually have enough resolution in the information that you're using to make your decisions to actually implement that great idea well. And so, happens, doesn't go so well, maybe there's not the support, maybe there's not a system in place to actually measure the actual outcomes, and so it feels like nothing happens. And then support fizzles, you stop, and then the next time somebody comes along with a great idea, and it could be you, it's like, last time that didn't go so well and it cost us a lot of money. So how about we don't try that? And that can then just create a whole nother challenge and a whole nother barrier to actually making something happen again. And my experience has been that whenever there's a great idea, that not great implementation that comes from having, and it's inevitable, if you don't have the information that you need to make good informed decisions, you're trying to fly blind, and in a really, really complex environment, everybody is going to fail more often than they're going to succeed in that environment. You have to have that good, solid information. And that's where the animal management plan comes in. So, basically the process of creating an animal management plan means that you get to carve out time and you sit and you look, who are my community? Who are the community leaders that we could be working with? Who are our different kind of cultural, who are our different language groups? What are our different socioeconomic bubbles? And some of that you'll actually just know from day-to-day experience of being on the ground. You know your kind of pockets where different people live. But actually sitting down and getting the good numbers on what is going on in your community, and then doing the same thing and defining what your animal management problems actually are. We hear a lot of, we've got too many cats. And then my next question is, well, what type of cats do you have? Because if you've got a bunch of kittens and they're all coming in from the same 3 streets in your community, and you will hear more about this, there is a solution for that problem, and that's to go into those 3 streets, talk to those people, get those cats to sex who are creating all of those kittens, and your problem has a control all of a sudden. But if you've just got too many cats, the answer is, what do I do about too many cats? And so animal management plans, essentially there's opportunities to sit down, carve out time, and actually become the bus driver. So aim of the game is to talk to everybody. Everybody, please sit on your seats on the bus. Let's have a conversation about all of this. Let's work out who are our superheroes that have the best strengths, and let's get a plan together that we can all get behind and implement. Even if we don't agree on everything, we can agree on some common goals. That's the power of the animal management plan. So, while you're here over the next few days, my hope is that everybody will get curious. And I don't mean curious like listen and think, that's great for you, I'm poor. Or that's great for you, my manager is definitely not going to be okay with that. Having a think about, how does that look in your community? Could it work? It might not work in the same version that you can see up here, but it could be that you can tweak it. It could be that you start small, start a little pilot program, and then build from there. But in order to do that, you need to know who your community actually are. You need to start chatting with those leaders in your community and getting those conversations happening so that you can start building that support and laying the foundation to make those things happen. And then for anything that you think, I actually have no idea what that looks like in my community, write your questions down, because this is, over the next 3 days, is when you're actually going to have this information in your head about what do I don't know? Oftentimes we don't know what we don't know, and this is an opportunity to try and find that out. Next thing I want you to get curious about are what your pet problems actually are. So if you're one of those people who's like, I have too many cats, start thinking about where are your cats coming from, how old are your cats, are these cats who have had an owner and so they're 8, 10, 12, 15 months old and they're not desexed and they're not identified. Somebody has been caring for that cat, I promise you. If there are a bunch of kittens, that looks different. So the solutions will look different, and the solution that works really, really well for a high socioeconomic area in the middle of Sydney is going to look completely different to the solution for a community that is out in the middle of nowhere, 200 kilometres from the closest vet, even if their problem is the same. So aim is basically get curious and get adaptable and just start thinking, can I tweak this? And do I know enough about my community and my pet problems to be able to tweak this? This is where, once you go home, this is where this very long, and I apologise for the length, document comes into play. So we have a copy of this over at the AIM desk, and if you are an AIM member, you can also just download it from the website. And there are some other documents that sit aside it that we'll talk about in a sec. And essentially, what this document is a guidance. We've tried to balance getting enough detail to make it step by step, with also leaving some flexibility for you to adapt it to your particular community type. We worked with a variety of stakeholders across kind of animal management and welfare, got a lot of feedback and just made tweaks and added resources and all sorts of stuff. And what that means is it did end up quite long, and there are a lot of resources in there that may or may not be useful for you, but they're useful for somebody across Australia. And so you need to have a look at it, have a think about your community, and then adapt. And this isn't a fill out the box. This isn't a compliance exercise that you're like, I'm really busy with my day-to-day stuff. I'm in Victoria. It's mandatory for me to do it. It's due on Thursday. Let's try and get it done as quick as we can and submit it. So this isn't that type of document, right? But it's a really powerful document if it's used really well. Now, some other resources that sit around it. In our process of the board, having a chat over the last few years about what the kind of main barriers and challenges that our members are actually experiencing, this theme has come through, and if you remember, you've probably seen some of the webinars with Nell and I talking about data. I'm a data nerd. So I'm like, ooh, that's sexy numbers. And I understand that not everybody is like that. So aim of the game for us when we were creating these is to make them as simple as possible. If you have access to Google, you have access to the Sheets version that you can use to collect your data. You don't have to have anything fancy, but these will hold enough information that you can actually tailor your domestic animal management plan. But also, if you've got shelter management software or if you've got population management software, you can pull that data out too, and if you don't know how, please come see us. And we are all here, so everybody in the board, except for poor Ron, who is at home nursing his wife because she's unwell, we're all here. Most of us are in our AIM shirts, but basically if you head over to the AIM, the AMREC or the Getting to Zero stand, you'll find one of us. Like I said, there's a copy over there, and there's also some instructions, because I know the website can be a little bit clunky sometimes when you're trying to find things, but there's instructions in there as well about how to access all of the member resources. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Di. Could the speakers quickly come up to the panel, and we'll just cut maybe 3 minutes into lunch and ask a couple of questions as they come up. I often think when I hear speakers talking in my head, I'm thinking of catchphrases that could potentially go on merch associated with an event. And I think Di gets the first catchphrase with, "Ooh, sexy numbers." I can see that on T-shirts everywhere. Yes. Oh, you can use your lapels.
Yeah, we didn't know.
No, just use the hand mics. It's fine. Yeah. Okay, first question is from Alison from D. The most common reasons for surrenders are that they didn't have rental permission and the landlord has told them the animal goes or they will have to. We understand this is a barrier, but ultimately this is why a lot of animals are surrendered. Do you encounter this in LA, and how do you combat that?
I think it's on. Thank you so much for the question. I don't know enough about your system, but I would think my first question is actually, is there a legal process for that? That's actually how we handle it in the US now, is a lot of times landlords, there is a legal process they're supposed to follow for eviction, and a lot of times it'll be intimidation that they use to say you have to give up your pet, but there's no legal recourse for that. So what we're trying to do is actually train some of our animal shelter staff and volunteers to ask the question. There, you have to be served something in writing for it to be actually legal. So you have to have a notice. So I think it just highlights that there's a lot of complexities and interconnectedness with human services. And so it could be just an opportunity to get more information. Doesn't mean that you have to turn into housing experts, but at least having some knowledge there and maybe working with a group that does eviction prevention or has some kind of resources for people who are in need.
Thank you, Alison. More about collaboration. It's something that keeps coming up in all of these discussions. Question now for Christina from Amanda. Is there a plan for the Vic government to start supporting TNR trials?
Thank you. So for those that have some familiarity with Victoria's legislative framework, you'll likely know the tricky part of TNR is the release component, especially because feral cats are declared as pests under the Catchment and Land Protection Act in Victoria. So that makes things a little bit tricky. Review of the current framework is definitely on the agenda for us, particularly if there are opportunities for reform that are going to support better cat management outcomes. But given legislative change takes time, one of the alternatives to TNR, we've coined TNA, so with the release being replaced by adopt. Lots of councils across Victoria have had some success with programs like this, and we're hoping that the grant funding that's come down as part of the Victorian Government's cat management initiative can further support those successes through the adoption endpoint rather than the release endpoint.
Thank you. A question for Meryl and Vicky from Gina. Do the pets get seen by a vet prior to adoption, and do they need to be sterilised and vaccinated?
Hello, and thanks for the question. Yes, they do need to be de-sex vaccinated and microchipped before entering the program. We do not require them to be vet checked, just to take the barriers out of it, but we do recommend an adopter to take the pet to a vet for a wellness check before the trial has ended. So we've got a 14-day cooling off period, and in case a pet is sick or there's some unforeseen health circumstances that they didn't think that would happen, that's when the pet can go back to their previous owner.
Great, thank you. And one final question before we break for lunch. This one's for Di from Sue, which is how do we engage councils to help when we know there is a community cat issue, but they're slow to engage? Any tips?
My answer would be start the conversation and really start it from a place of curiosity. So often what we do is we go in and we do I know what's best here. And often we're doing that because we've been around a while and we know an awful lot. And so sometimes that is actually what ends up happening, is that your solution is the solution. But there is nobody in the world who you can go to who doesn't agree with you at that point in time and say, I know better than you. And they're going to go, yeah, you do. It's not the way we work. So start the conversation and find out what are their big barriers. Because oftentimes there are those kind of barriers for them at their level, which could be, and often is, actually getting the funding to make it happen. Because the way most funding works for councils is that you basically got to have the animal in care, right? Which means you've got to bring them in first. And then it's like, okay, cool, we've got a bill that we can pay. And so getting funding at that local level, particularly when you're trying to drive up the chain, is very, very difficult for people in animal management, even if they're super keen to make something happen. So start the conversation, find out what the barriers are, and then find out how you can help. It could be that you can help them, drum up some public support for something like that. It could be that you know about things they don't know. It all starts with that first step of just talking and getting a bit curious about each other and seeing if you can tackle the problem together rather than discussing it in a heated way on the bus.
Thank you so much, Di. Please join me in thanking all of our speakers from our second session today.